Shy millionaire, single for 15 years, spends a passionate night with a doctor, stunned by a twin surprise. Hello, my dear viewers and listeners. A very warm and heartfelt welcome to each and every one of you. I'm truly grateful that you've chosen to spend your precious time here with me today. Before we begin, let's take a moment to center ourselves and open our hearts with a short, beautiful prayer. Dear Lord, bless each person listening to this today. Fill their hearts with peace, love, and understanding. Let this story touch their souls, heal any hidden pain, and bring light into their hearts. May they find comfort, joy, and inspiration in every word they hear today. Bless their lives with happiness, and may they always feel surrounded by love and warmth. Amen. Now, my dear friends, today's story is truly special. It's a blockbuster. This story is not just about love. It's about deep emotions, powerful feelings, and the kind of connection that touches the very core of your soul. I promise you, this story will stay with you long after it ends, so please don't skip a single second. It's my special request to you all. Stay with me until the end because I know you're going to love it. And please, if you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to me, and it helps me bring you even more heart-touching stories in the future. Now, let's begin this beautiful, emotional journey together. Get comfortable, open your heart, and let the story take you away. Scott Anderson, a 40-year-old millionaire, had spent the last 15 years of his life buried in silence and solitude, despite having a life most people could only dream of. He was the owner of a vast business empire that stretched across continents, with luxury estates, private jets, and a lifestyle that should have made him feel invincible. But behind the glossy surface of his success lay a heart burdened with loneliness and a crippling sense of shyness that controlled every aspect of his personal life. His shyness wasn't just a minor personality trait. It was a deep-rooted fear that paralyzed him whenever he tried to open up to someone on a personal level. While other men in his social circle enjoyed glamorous parties, romantic relationships, and a rotating cast of beautiful women, Scott avoided even the most basic human interactions unless they were strictly professional. Business meetings, investment decisions, market expansions, those were easy for him. He could stand in front of a room full of high-powered executives and negotiate multi-million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. But put him in front of a woman, and he'd shut down completely. It wasn't that he hadn't tried. Over the years, countless women had shown interest in him. His status as a young, successful, and attractive billionaire made him the target of many socialites, models, and actresses. Yet every time someone approached him with romantic intentions, Scott would find a way to retreat. Sometimes it was subtle. He would excuse himself to take an urgent business call or suddenly remember a meeting. Other times it was obvious. He'd stand frozen, stammering through broken sentences, eyes cast downward, before finally walking away altogether. The more it happened, the more he convinced himself that love wasn't meant for him. He had told himself so many times that he simply wasn't wired for relationships, that his brain was too business-oriented, too practical, to handle something as chaotic and emotional as love. His inner circle, his business advisors, and even his personal assistant tried to encourage him to step out of his comfort zone. "Scott, you need to live a little," his assistant Mark would say. "You're 40 years old, for God's sake. You've built an empire. What's the point of all this money if you've got no one to share it with?" Scott would smile politely, but deep down, those words stung because he knew they were true. He had everything, yet he had nothing at all. His penthouse in Manhattan was a testament to his success, a sleek, glass-walled masterpiece with panoramic views of the city skyline. But it was also unbearably empty. He would return home after long business trips to the deafening silence of his expansive living room, where the only sounds were the soft hum of the central air conditioning and the occasional clink of ice in his whiskey glass. On more than one occasion, he had stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the glittering lights of the city below, wondering why he couldn't shake the hollow ache in his chest. He would tell himself that he was fine, that he didn't need anyone. But at night, when he lay in his enormous king-sized bed alone, he would feel the weight of his isolation pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. Sometimes he would dream of a woman, faceless but warm, lying beside him, her hand resting on his chest, her breath soft against his skin. He'd wake up with a painful sense of longing that he could never satisfy. Scott's shyness had become a cage, locking him away from the very thing he secretly craved the most: connection. The few times he had tried to force himself into the dating scene had been disastrous. On one occasion, a close friend had set him up on a blind date with a gorgeous model. The moment Scott sat down across from her, he had felt his throat tighten. He struggled to make eye contact, fumbled with his silverware, and barely managed to get through the appetizers without sweating through his shirt. By the time dessert arrived, the model had politely excused herself to go to the restroom and never returned. After that humiliation, Scott had sworn off dating altogether. Business became his shield, his excuse, and his hiding place. He threw himself into his work with relentless focus, turning his company into one of the most successful private corporations in the world. He told himself that success was enough, that the admiration and respect he commanded in the business world would fill the void in his heart. But it didn't. The more successful he became, the lonelier he felt. Scott's mansion in the Hamptons was a prime example of his empty life. He had bought it years ago, thinking that it would become a place where he could host friends, throw summer parties, and maybe even start a family someday. But the house remained cold and unused, its expansive rooms gathering dust. The house staff came and went, maintaining the place to perfection, but Scott rarely stayed there for more than a weekend. He would sit by the pool with a glass of bourbon, watching the sun set over the water, wondering what it would feel like to sit there with someone else's hand in his. His shyness wasn't just social. It ran so deep that it affected his emotional core. He had taught himself to be independent to the point of detachment, convincing himself that he didn't need love or companionship. He had become so good at hiding behind his business persona that even his closest business partners had no idea how lonely he truly was. When Scott attended charity events or high-profile galas, he wore the mask of the successful billionaire effortlessly. He would smile at the cameras, give generous donations, and shake hands with celebrities and politicians. But the moment the event was over, he would slip away quietly, returning to the sanctuary of his penthouse, where no one could see how truly empty his life had become. Deep down, Scott wanted to change. He wasn't blind to his emotional emptiness. He knew that his wealth couldn't protect him from the human need for connection. He had spent years convincing himself that love was too complicated, too risky. He told himself that people would only love him for his money, that no one would see past his wealth to the insecure man beneath. But in his heart, he craved the kind of love that money couldn't buy. A love that would see him, understand him, and accept him for who he truly was. What Scott didn't realize was that his life was about to change in ways he never imagined. His lonely heart was about to collide with something so powerful, so life-altering, that even his crippling shyness wouldn't be able to hold him back. Love was coming for him, and this time it wouldn't take no for an answer. It was an unusually warm afternoon when Scott Anderson found himself walking through the glass doors of St. Mary's Hospital for a routine checkup, something his personal assistant, Mark, had practically forced him to schedule after months of ignoring his health. Scott had no real desire to be there. He was perfectly healthy, or so he told himself, but Mark had insisted that regular checkups were important, especially for someone in his position. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit with a crisp white shirt, Scott looked every bit the powerful millionaire he was. But beneath that composed exterior, he was a mess of nerves. Hospitals made him uncomfortable. Not because he was afraid of doctors or needles, but because hospitals meant interacting with people on a personal level. And that was something Scott had always struggled with. He hated small talk, hated the vulnerability that came with being poked and prodded by doctors asking personal questions. His shyness wasn't something most people understood. They saw the successful, confident businessman who commanded boardrooms and made billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. But the moment he had to engage in anything remotely personal, he shut down. That was why, as he sat in the pristine waiting room with its pale blue walls and the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead, his knee bounced restlessly and his hands gripped the edges of the sleek leather armchair. He glanced at his watch, wishing the appointment was already over. Then the door to the examination room opened and Scott's entire world shifted. Standing there was the most breathtaking woman he had ever seen, Dr. Sarah Williams. She was tall and effortlessly elegant, with rich brown skin that glowed under the clinical lights. Her braided hair cascaded over her shoulders, and when she smiled, Scott felt something inside him unravel. She wore a fitted white lab coat over navy blue scrubs, her dark brown eyes warm and observant. Scott felt his breath hitch the moment their eyes met, or rather when her eyes met his, because Scott immediately lowered his gaze, his shyness crashing down on him like a tidal wave. "Mr. Anderson?" Her voice was smooth, melodic. Scott swallowed hard and forced himself to look up. Yes," he stammered, mentally cursing himself for already sounding like a fool. Sarah's smile didn't waver. "Come on in," she said, stepping aside to let him pass. Scott stood slowly, his heart pounding so hard he was sure Sarah could hear it. He kept his gaze down as he walked past her, the faint scent of jasmine and vanilla trailing after her. He sat down on the examination table, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as Sarah closed the door behind her. "So," she said, sitting down on the stool across from him, her eyes bright and inquisitive. "What brings you in today?" Scott's mouth felt dry. He forced himself to clear his throat. "Just a checkup." His voice was so low he wasn't even sure she heard him. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her expression calm and patient. "Well, I'm glad you came in. It's important to take care of yourself." Scott could feel the heat creeping up his neck. He knew this was just standard doctor-patient conversation, but the fact that Sarah was looking at him, really looking at him, made his pulse spike. He was used to women looking at him with interest, but Sarah's gaze wasn't calculating or superficial. It was kind, curious, as if she genuinely wanted to understand him. Scott was acutely aware of the way his palms were sweating. His instinct was to retreat, to find some excuse to cut this interaction short. But something about Sarah's presence held him in place. He stole a quick glance at her face and immediately regretted it because the intensity of her beauty made his stomach flip. Her cheekbones were high and defined, her full lips curved into a subtle smile, and those eyes were so deep and warm, he felt like he could drown in them. Sarah smiled, sensing his discomfort. "Relax, Mr. Anderson, I promise I don't bite." That made him smile, just barely, but it was enough for Sarah to notice. "See? That's better," she said, her tone playful. Scott felt his chest tighten. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent years training himself to avoid emotional connections, to keep things strictly business. But sitting there in front of Sarah, he felt vulnerable in a way he hadn't felt in years. And yet, he didn't hate it. "Let me check your heart rate," Sarah said, standing and taking the stethoscope from around her neck. Scott's body stiffened as Sarah stepped closer, the warmth of her presence washing over him. He held his breath as she pressed the cool metal of the stethoscope against his chest. Her hand brushed his arm, and Scott nearly flinched from the contact. Sarah's eyes flicked up to his. "Breathe," she said softly. Scott inhaled shakily, her gaze pinning him in place. He could feel his heart hammering beneath the stethoscope, and Sarah smiled. Fast heartbeat. "Are you nervous?" Scott's mouth twitched at the corner. "A little," he admitted. Sarah's smile widened. "Don't worry, you're doing fine." Scott's heart rate didn't slow, but not because he was nervous about the exam. It was because Sarah was standing so close, looking at him with those warm eyes and that easy smile. When Sarah finished the exam, she sat down and studied him thoughtfully. "You know," she said, "I've read about you. Anderson Enterprises, right?" Scott nodded, forcing himself to meet her gaze for more than a second. "Yes." "You've done some incredible things in the business world." Scott's eyes darted downward. "I suppose. But you're not very comfortable talking about yourself, are you?" Sarah's tone was gentle, not mocking. Scott's mouth curled into a faint, self-conscious smile. "Not really." "That's okay," Sarah said softly. "I like quiet men." Scott's eyes snapped up to hers, his pulse spiking. Was she flirting with him? No, surely not. Women didn't flirt with him. But Sarah was smiling at him with unmistakable warmth. "You're not as intimidating as I thought you'd be," she teased. Scott actually laughed, a low, nervous sound. "That's a first." Sarah stood, her hand brushing his arm lightly. "Well, Mr. Anderson, your checkup looks good, but I think you might benefit from a little more relaxation. Less business, more living." Scott's throat tightened. "I'll consider that." Sarah's smile softened. "Good." She handed him a piece of paper with her handwritten signature at the bottom. "Here's my number, in case you have any questions." Scott's hand trembled slightly as he took the paper. Sarah's gaze lingered on his face for a moment before she walked toward the door. "Take care, Scott," she said, her voice light. Scott watched her go, his heart still hammering against his ribs. When the door closed behind her, he looked down at the paper in his hand. Her number. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Then slowly, a smile curled at the edge of his lips. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, a spark of possibility. From the moment Sarah first laid eyes on Scott Anderson, something inside her shifted. A quiet but undeniable pull that settled in her chest like a warm glow. She had treated hundreds of patients in her career, but none had affected her the way Scott did. He was unlike any man she had ever encountered, not just because he was devastatingly handsome with his sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes, and perfectly tousled dark hair, but because there was a quiet vulnerability beneath his polished exterior that intrigued her. Scott's reputation preceded him. He was the elusive millionaire, the man who had built an empire from nothing, known for his strategic brilliance and ruthless business acumen. And yet, sitting in her examination room, he had looked so human, nervous, shy. The way he had avoided her gaze, the soft tremble in his hands when he took the paper with her number. Those details lingered in Sarah's mind long after he had left the hospital. She found herself thinking about him at odd moments, during her lunch break while driving home, even as she lay in bed at night, her mind replaying the quiet way he had smiled when she teased him. Sarah wasn't blind to the effect she had on men. She knew she was attractive. Her smooth brown skin and long braided hair had drawn attention her whole life, but she had always been careful, guarded even, about who she allowed close. Yet with Scott there was no hesitation. She wanted to know him, and she could sense that Scott wanted to know her too, if only he could get past his shyness. For Scott, the effect was even more profound. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about Sarah since that day in the hospital. He carried her number in his wallet, glancing at it more times than he would ever admit. His mind kept returning to the way her eyes had softened when she smiled at him, the scent of jasmine and vanilla that lingered in the air after she left. Scott had always been good at compartmentalizing his emotions. He had spent years perfecting the art of appearing unaffected, especially in business. But Sarah had shattered that control with one smile. He lay awake at night, replaying their conversation in his head, wondering if he had imagined the warmth in her gaze, the quiet flirtation in her tone. But even if it was real, what could he do about it? Scott's shyness wasn't a small hurdle. It was a wall he had built around himself over years of isolation. After his last failed relationship, if it could even be called that, he had convinced himself that love wasn't for him. He was too closed off, too emotionally guarded. And yet, Sarah made him want to try. He found himself lingering near his phone more than usual, his thumb hovering over her number. But the thought of actually calling her made his pulse spike. What would he even say? "Hi, I'm Scott. I'm incapable of holding a normal conversation, but I can't stop thinking about you." No, that would be insane. But fate had other plans. 2 days after their first meeting, Scott's company sponsored a charity gala for the hospital. He hadn't planned on attending. He usually avoided social events unless his presence was absolutely necessary, but when Mark reminded him that the hospital staff would be there, Scott's heart rate jumped. He told himself it was a coincidence. He wasn't going to see her. He was going to support the hospital. But the moment he stepped into the grand ballroom, his eyes immediately sought her out. And there she was, across the room, laughing with a group of doctors. She wore a sleek black gown that hugged her figure perfectly, her braided hair cascading down her back. Scott's chest tightened painfully. He wanted to walk toward her, but his feet felt like they were cemented to the floor. As if sensing his gaze, Sarah's eyes lifted and locked with his. A slow, knowing smile curved her lips, and she excused herself from the group. Scott's heart hammered as she walked toward him, the crowd parting naturally around her, as if even the universe couldn't resist her pull. "Scott," she said, her tone light but her eyes intense. Scott's mouth went dry. "Hi. I didn't expect to see you here," she teased. Scott managed a half smile. "Neither did I." Sarah tilted her head, studying him. "Are you going to ask me to dance?" Scott froze. I don't really dance." Sarah's smile deepened. "Good. I don't either." She reached for his hand, and Scott's pulse jumped as her fingers brushed his. He let her lead him toward the edge of the dance floor. The music was soft, a slow ballad that should have made it easier, but all Scott could think about was how close she was. Her hand rested lightly on his shoulder, her other hand warm in his. Scott's hands felt awkward and too big, and he was sure he was holding her wrong, but Sarah didn't seem to mind. She smiled up at him, her eyes shining. "You're doing fine," she whispered. Scott's throat tightened. "I'm not sure I am." "You are," she insisted, her voice soft. "Just breathe." Scott forced himself to relax, his hands settling more naturally on her waist. Their bodies moved slowly, Sarah's head tilting closer to his chest. Scott inhaled shakily, the scent of her hair making his head spin. He wanted to say something, anything, but his mind was a blank slate. Sarah seemed to sense his struggle. She lifted her head and brushed her lips lightly against his cheek. Scott's breath hitched. His hand tightened slightly on her waist. "Sarah?" He couldn't get the words out. He wanted to tell her how beautiful she was, how he hadn't stopped thinking about her since the hospital. But his shyness locked the words in his throat. Sarah smiled knowingly. "It's okay, Scott. You don't have to say anything." Scott's eyes searched hers. I'm not very good at this." Sarah's hand slid up to cup his jaw. "That's okay," she whispered. "I like that about you." Scott's breath hitched. He had never met anyone so patient, so understanding. Sarah leaned in, her mouth brushing softly against his. Scott's body went rigid at first, his mind short-circuiting. But then he relaxed, his lips parting under hers. It was soft, hesitant, but the heat beneath it was unmistakable. When Sarah pulled back, her eyes searched his face. Was that okay? Scott's mouth curved in a rare smile. More than okay. Sarah laughed softly, her hand brushing down his chest. Good, because I'm not finished with you yet. Scott's eyes darkened. You're not? No, Sarah said, threading her fingers through his. I'm going to make you fall for me. Scott's throat tightened. He was already falling. Fast. But he couldn't say that, not yet. So he smiled, squeezed her hand, and whispered, I think you already have. And for the first time in years, Scott felt the heavy weight of loneliness lifting from his chest. Sarah wasn't just breaking down his walls. She was walking straight into his heart. After weeks of lingering glances, stolen smiles, and quiet tension hanging between them, Sarah finally decided to take control of the situation. She had been patient, reading Scott's shy hesitation with understanding, but she could see the desire in his eyes, the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing he had ever seen, but couldn't quite find the courage to say it aloud. Sarah wasn't the type to sit back and let life pass her by, so one evening, after finishing a long shift at the hospital, she pulled out her phone and called him. Scott nearly dropped his phone when he saw her name on the screen. His heart thundered so loudly he thought she might hear it through the phone. He hesitated for a moment, then forced himself to answer. Hello? His voice sounded strained, nervous. Hi, Scott. Sarah's voice was warm, playful. Are you busy tomorrow night? Scott's throat tightened. No. Why? Good, she said, the smile evident in her tone. I want to have dinner with you. Scott's heart seized. Dinner? Yes, Scott, Sarah laughed softly. Dinner. As in you and me sitting at a table, eating food, having a conversation. You know, a date. Scott's pulse spiked so hard he had to sit down. You want to go on a date with me? Yes, Sarah's voice softened. But only if you want to. Scott's mouth went dry. He wanted to say yes. He wanted it so badly it terrified him. I don't know if I'm good at this kind of thing. You don't have to be good at it, Sarah assured him. You just have to show up. After a long pause, Scott whispered, Okay. The next evening, Scott stood in front of his full-length mirror, adjusting his shirt for the 5th time. He had no idea what to wear, no idea how to act. His hands were clammy, his heart a nervous wreck beneath his chest. He was a millionaire. He had closed multi-million-dollar business deals without breaking a sweat. But the idea of sitting across from Sarah at dinner had him unraveling. He settled on a fitted black suit with a dark blue dress shirt underneath, hoping it wasn't too formal. His driver dropped him off at the restaurant Sarah had chosen, a small, intimate Italian place with dim lighting and soft jazz music drifting through the air. Scott's palms were sweating as he stepped inside, and then he saw her. Sarah sat at a table near the window, the streetlights outside casting a soft glow on her stunning brown skin. Her long braided hair was swept over one shoulder, and she wore a dark green dress that hugged her curves perfectly. Scott's breath hitched. She was breathtaking. Sarah's eyes lit up when she saw him, and she stood to greet him. You came, she smiled. Scott swallowed hard, his feet feeling like lead as he walked toward her. Of course, he managed. He hesitated, unsure whether to hug her or shake her hand or... Sarah solved the problem by leaning in and pressing a soft kiss to his cheek. Scott's breath hitched. You look beautiful, he said, his voice rough. Thank you, Sarah's eyes sparkled. You clean up pretty well yourself. They sat down, and Scott immediately felt the pressure in his chest increase. What was he supposed to say? His mind was a blank slate, so he focused on the menu. But then Sarah's foot brushed lightly against his under the table, and his eyes shot up to meet hers. She was smiling knowingly. "Relax, Scott," she whispered. "It's just me. Just her." But that was the problem. It wasn't just her, it was Sarah. Stunning, confident, warm Sarah who made his head spin. He forced himself to breathe, and when the waiter came, Sarah ordered a glass of red wine while Scott nervously stuck to water. "So," Sarah began, leaning her elbow on the table, her chin resting on her hand, "why have you been hiding from the world for the past 15 years? Scott's stomach tightened. He knew Sarah wasn't asking to be cruel. There was genuine curiosity in her eyes, but it was still hard to answer. He cleared his throat. "I guess I've been busy." "Busy?" Sarah lifted a brow. "You're a millionaire, Scott. I'm pretty sure you could afford to take a vacation or go on a date if you wanted to." Scott's gaze dropped to the table. "It's not that simple." "Why?" Scott hesitated. "Because I'm not good at this." "At what?" Sarah asked gently. Talking, dating, opening up." Scott rubbed the back of his neck. "My last relationship ended. Badly. After that, I just kind of stopped trying." Sarah studied him for a moment, her gaze softening. "So you've been alone all this time?" Scott nodded. "Yeah." "That's a long time to be alone, Scott." "I guess I got used to it. Or maybe you just stopped believing someone would want to know you." Scott's head jerked up. Sarah's gaze was calm but piercing. Scott's mouth went dry. "Maybe." Sarah smiled faintly. "Well, I want to know you." Scott's chest tightened. He couldn't look away from her. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the waiter arrived with their food. They ate slowly, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics: Sarah's work at the hospital, the latest news in Scott's business. But there was an undercurrent beneath it all, a growing warmth between them that Scott couldn't deny. By the time dessert arrived, Scott was feeling more relaxed than he had in years. Sarah had a way of making him feel safe, like he didn't have to be perfect with her. After the meal, they walked outside together. A light breeze rustled Sarah's braids as they stood beneath the glow of the streetlights. "Well," Sarah said softly, "that was nice." Scott's heart hammered. He wanted to kiss her. He wanted to reach out and touch her hand, but he froze. His shyness was still there, holding him back. Sarah smiled knowingly. "It's okay, Scott," she whispered. She leaned up and kissed him softly on the cheek. Scott's eyes widened. "Good night," Sarah whispered. "Good night," Scott breathed. He watched her walk away, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. And as he stood there beneath the glow of the streetlights, he knew one thing for sure. He was falling for her. Fast. And this time he wasn't sure he could stop himself. After several weeks of romantic dinners, stolen glances, and the quiet intimacy that had grown between them, Sarah knew the moment had come. She had been patient, giving Scott time to adjust to the idea of someone caring for him, but she could see it in his eyes, the way he watched her with quiet admiration, the way his body tensed slightly when she brushed against him, the way his gaze lingered on her lips longer than necessary. He was in love with her. She could feel it in the way his heart raced when she held his hand, in the way his eyes softened whenever she smiled at him. But Scott was holding himself back, his shyness still creating a barrier between them. Sarah had never been one to sit and wait for life to happen. She knew what she wanted, and what she wanted was Scott. So, after another romantic dinner, as they walked along the quiet street under the soft glow of streetlights, Sarah decided that enough was enough. She reached for Scott's hand, her fingers curling around his trembling ones. Scott's breath hitched, his eyes widening slightly as he looked down at their joined hands. Sarah's heart pounded, but her gaze remained steady as she stopped walking and turned to face him. The cool night air brushed against her skin, but the warmth of Scott's hand in hers was enough to make her feel grounded. "Scott," she whispered, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Scott's gaze darted toward the ground, his lips parting as though he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Sarah smiled softly and touched his jaw, tilting his face toward hers. His eyes were wide, his pupils dark with quiet longing. "Scott," she said again, her voice soft but certain. "I've fallen in love with you." Scott's whole body went still. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes widened. What? His voice was barely a whisper. Sarah smiled, her thumb brushing along his jawline. "I love you," she repeated, her gaze steady. "I've known it for a while now. Every time you look at me, every time you struggle to speak because you're nervous, every time you smile when you think I'm not looking. I feel it. And I know you feel it too." Scott's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His chest was rising and falling too quickly, and Sarah could see the storm of emotions swirling behind his eyes. Fear, hope, disbelief. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He shook his head slowly, his hand trembling as it lifted to brush against her cheek. His voice cracked. "Sarah, I love you too." Sarah's heart leaped. "You do?" Scott nodded slowly, his gaze locking with hers. "I've been in love with you since the first day I saw you, but I'm not good at this. I'm shy." Sarah's smile deepened as her fingers brushed over his knuckles. "I know," she whispered, "but that doesn't change the way I feel." Scott's hand tightened in hers, his jaw clenching as if he was battling against the vulnerability that threatened to consume him. "I don't want to disappoint you," he admitted. "You won't," Sarah assured him. "Scott, you've already given me everything I want. Your time, your trust, your quiet affection. I see it, even when you don't say it." Scott's eyes glistened with a raw vulnerability that made Sarah's chest tighten. "But what if I'm not enough for you?" Sarah leaned closer, her lips brushing against the corner of his mouth. "You already are." Scott's breath hitched. His hand slid up to her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw as though she were something delicate, something precious. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "You don't have to know," Sarah said softly. "Just love me." Scott's gaze darkened, his hand tightening in her hair, as though he was grounding himself. His forehead pressed against hers, and his breath trembled as he whispered, "I love you." Sarah smiled, her hands sliding up to wrap around his neck. "Then show me." Scott's lips parted, his breath shaky as he leaned in, his mouth hovering over hers. His lips brushed against hers, so softly that Sarah almost thought she imagined it. But then Scott kissed her, tentative at first, as though afraid to break her, but then stronger, more certain. His hand slid into her hair, his mouth claiming hers with a quiet desperation that made Sarah's knees weak. When they finally broke apart, Scott's forehead rested against hers, his breathing uneven. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. Sarah's hands cupped his face, her gaze fierce and steady. "Yes, you do," she said firmly. "You deserve to be loved, Scott, and I'm going to keep loving you until you believe that." Scott's hand slid down her back, pulling her closer until her body was pressed against his. "I'm scared," he admitted. "I know," Sarah whispered, "but I'm not going anywhere." Scott's eyes softened, the tension in his shoulders easing as Sarah smiled up at him. And then, as if a wall had finally broken between them, Scott wrapped his arms fully around her, pulling her into a deep, soul-stealing kiss. Sarah melted against him, her heart thundering as Scott's hand slid over her back, his body pressed firmly against hers. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah smiled up at him, breathless. "So, does this mean you'll let me love you?" Scott's gaze darkened, his lips curving into a shy but genuine smile. "Yes," he whispered. "I don't know how to stop loving you." Sarah's heart swelled as Scott's hand curled around her waist. He looked down at her like she was the most precious thing he had ever held. "I love you," he whispered again, his lips brushing against her temple. Sarah smiled, her arms tightening around his neck. "I love you too," she whispered back. And as they stood beneath the stars, wrapped in each other's arms, Scott knew there was no turning back. He had finally found the love he had spent his whole life searching for, and he wasn't about to let it go. After their heartfelt confession, Scott and Sarah's bond deepened in ways neither of them could have anticipated. Scott, once so guarded and hesitant, now found himself craving Sarah's presence constantly. Her touch, her voice, her smile, all of it had become a lifeline, pulling him out of the quiet emptiness he had known for years. Days turned into nights of tender glances and stolen touches, the unspoken desire between them growing stronger with each passing moment. But Scott's shyness still lingered, holding him back from fully giving himself to the woman who had already claimed his heart. Sarah sensed it, the way he would tense when her fingers brushed against his skin, the way his breath would hitch when she leaned in close, the way his gaze would darken with longing, only to flicker away in hesitation. But Sarah wasn't going to wait forever. She knew Scott loved her. She had felt it in the way his hands lingered at the small of her back, in the way his eyes softened whenever she smiled. And now it was time to close the distance between them once and for all. One evening, after a quiet dinner at Scott's sprawling penthouse, Sarah decided to take the lead. The city lights glittered through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a soft glow across the room. Scott sat on the plush leather couch, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his dark hair slightly tousled from the tension he had been carrying all evening. Sarah sat beside him, her smooth brown skin glowing under the soft lighting, her braided hair cascading down her back. Scott's gaze lingered on her lips, but as soon as Sarah turned toward him, he looked away. A small smile touched Sarah's lips as she leaned in closer, her hand resting on his thigh. "Scott," she whispered, her voice low and inviting. Scott's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Yes?" His voice was strained, low. Sarah's fingers slid upward, tracing along the inside of his thigh. Scott's breath hitched and his gaze shot to hers, wide and dark with quiet desperation. "You don't have to hold back anymore," Sarah whispered. Scott's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "I don't want to hurt you," he murmured. Sarah smiled, her hand slipping to his jaw as she leaned in. "Then don't," she whispered. And before Scott could pull away, Sarah kissed him. Her lips were soft and warm, and Scott's whole body froze beneath her touch. But then something inside him snapped. His hands flew to her waist, dragging her onto his lap as his mouth claimed hers with sudden hunger. Sarah gasped against his lips, her arms wrapping around his neck as Scott's hands slid down her back, pressing her closer. His shyness melted beneath the heat of her kiss, his hesitation dissolving as her tongue swept against his. Scott groaned, his hands tangling in her braids as he deepened the kiss. His breathing grew ragged as his mouth moved to her neck, tracing along her collarbone. Sarah arched into him, her head falling back as Scott's hands slid beneath her blouse, his fingers tracing along her bare skin. He pulled away suddenly, his breath coming in harsh gasps as he stared at her with wide, dark eyes. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse, I don't know how to..." Sarah smiled, her fingers brushing through his hair. "You don't have to know," she whispered. "Just feel." Scott's gaze darkened, his hands sliding to her hips as he pulled her closer. "I'm not going to stop," he warned, his voice low and strained. Sarah smiled. "I don't want you to." That was all Scott needed. His lips crashed against hers with sudden, unrestrained hunger. His hands slid beneath her blouse, pulling it over her head as Sarah's fingers worked at the buttons of his shirt. Scott's mouth moved along her shoulder, his hands sliding down her back as he pulled her fully into his arms. Sarah gasped as Scott lifted her effortlessly, carrying her toward the bedroom without breaking the kiss. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the city lights streaming through the windows. Scott laid Sarah down on the bed, his body hovering over hers as his lips traced along her jawline. Sarah's fingers curled into his hair, her breathing sharp and uneven as Scott's hands slid down her sides. His hesitation was gone now, replaced by raw, unrestrained need. Scott's mouth moved lower, his hands skimming along the smooth curves of her body as Sarah's back arched beneath him. Her hands slid down his back, pulling him closer as their bodies molded together. Scott's breath was shaky as he pulled back just enough to look at her. "Are you sure?" he whispered. Sarah smiled, her fingers brushing against his cheek. "I've never been more sure of anything." Scott's eyes darkened, his hand sliding to the back of her neck as he kissed her deeply. Their bodies moved together in perfect harmony, the barriers of Scott's shyness finally crumbling beneath the intensity of their connection. Scott's hands trembled as they traced the curves of Sarah's body, his mouth worshipping her skin as she whispered his name. Hours passed, but neither of them noticed. The night melted away in a haze of passion and quiet intimacy. Scott's hands never stopped moving over Sarah's skin, his lips never straying far from hers. Sarah's soft gasps filled the room, mingling with Scott's low groans as they lost themselves in each other completely. When they finally lay tangled together beneath the sheets, Scott's arm draped protectively over Sarah's waist. Sarah's head rested against his chest, her fingers tracing lazy patterns over his skin. Scott's breathing was slow and steady, his hand sliding up and down her back as he pressed a soft kiss against her forehead. "I didn't know it could feel like this," Scott whispered. Sarah smiled against his chest, her hand curling over his heart. "You just needed the right person," she murmured. Scott's hand slid beneath her chin, lifting her face to his. His gaze was soft, vulnerable in a way Sarah had never seen before. "I love you," he whispered. Sarah's heart swelled. "I love you too." Scott's hand slid into her hair as he kissed her deeply. His body pressed against hers, already stirring with renewed desire. Sarah's fingers curled into his back as Scott's mouth traced along her jawline. "I don't think I'll ever get enough of you," Scott murmured. Sarah smiled, her legs tangling with his. "Then don't stop." Scott's gaze darkened as he pulled her beneath him, his lips claiming hers once more. The night stretched on, filled with whispered confessions and quiet intimacy as Scott and Sarah lost themselves in each other completely. Scott had finally broken free of his shyness, and now that he had, there was no turning back. Sarah had given him the courage to love, and Scott knew he was never letting her go. After that passionate night, Scott's entire world shifted. The walls of shyness and hesitation that had bound him for years began to crumble, replaced by an insatiable craving for Sarah's presence, her touch, her very existence. He woke up the next morning with Sarah curled up against his chest, her soft brown skin glowing under the early sunlight filtering through the curtains. Scott's arm tightened around her waist, his fingers tracing lazy patterns along her back as his lips pressed gently to her forehead. He felt a sense of peace he had never known before, but beneath that peace was a growing need, an addiction to everything Sarah was. Her scent lingered on his sheets, her warmth still wrapped around his skin, and Scott knew he was in trouble. He couldn't stop thinking about her. When Sarah left for work that morning, Scott's gaze followed her until the door closed behind her. The emptiness that settled over him in her absence was unbearable. He paced the penthouse for hours, replaying the way her body had fit so perfectly against his, the way her breath had hitched when he kissed her neck, the way her fingers had clutched his back when he whispered her name. Scott found himself picking up his phone several times only to put it back down. What if he came across as needy? What if she thought he was too intense? But then the memory of Sarah's smile, her soft moans, the way her eyes had darkened with desire as he had touched her, it all drove him to the edge. He gave in and texted her, "I miss you." The response came almost immediately, "I miss you too." Scott's breath caught in his throat. That simple confirmation ignited something inside him, a hunger, a deep craving for more. That night, when Sarah arrived at his penthouse after her shift, Scott's hands were already pulling her inside before the door had even closed behind her. He pressed her against the wall, his mouth covering hers with desperate hunger. Sarah gasped against his lips, her arms winding around his neck as Scott's hands slid down to her hips. "I couldn't stop thinking about you," Scott whispered, his voice rough with need. Sarah smiled, her fingers threading through his dark hair. "Good. I don't want you to stop." Scott growled low in his throat, lifting her off her feet as her legs wrapped around his waist. He carried her to the bedroom, his mouth never leaving hers. That night was even more intense than the first. Scott's hands moved with more confidence, his mouth exploring her body with an urgency that bordered on obsession. Sarah's soft cries filled the room as Scott lost himself in her completely, his shyness evaporating beneath the weight of his growing addiction. When they finally collapsed beneath the sheets, Sarah's head resting on Scott's chest, Scott ran his fingers through her braids and whispered, "I don't know what you've done to me, but I need more." Sarah smiled, pressing a soft kiss to his chest. "Then take more," she whispered. And Scott did. The days that followed blurred into a haze of stolen kisses, passionate nights, and quiet mornings tangled beneath the sheets. Scott found himself craving Sarah in a way that was almost frightening. He began rearranging his work schedule just to spend more time with her. Meetings were rescheduled, phone calls were ignored, nothing mattered more than Sarah. When he wasn't with her, he was thinking about her, counting down the minutes until he could see her again. And Sarah was just as hooked. Her eyes would light up the moment Scott walked into the room, and the tension between them would ignite instantly. Even when they were surrounded by other people, Scott's hand would find the small of her back, his fingers tracing gentle circles against her skin. The way she leaned into him, the way her smile softened when he touched her, it fed Scott's growing addiction to her love. His shyness, once a crippling burden, was melting away beneath Sarah's unwavering warmth. Scott began to change. He became more confident, more open. He started speaking more during their dinners, making her laugh with quiet jokes and surprising her with thoughtful gestures. He sent flowers to her office, waited outside the hospital with coffee after her long shifts, and took her hand without hesitation when they walked together. His business associates noticed the change in him, how he seemed more relaxed, more focused. But the truth was, Scott's focus was entirely on Sarah. He found himself reaching for her hand even when they were just sitting together in silence. His shyness had been replaced by an obsession, a deep need to be near her. And Sarah was no better. Her phone buzzed with messages from Scott throughout the day. "Thinking about you. Miss you already. When can I see you again?" And Sarah would smile each time, her heart swelling with warmth. One evening, Sarah showed up at Scott's penthouse wearing a sleek black dress, her hair styled in perfect braids that cascaded down her back. Scott's mouth went dry the moment he saw her. "Wow," he breathed. Sarah's smile widened. "Like what you see." Scott crossed the room in 3 steps, his hands sliding to her waist as his mouth covered hers in a heated kiss. That night, Scott didn't hesitate. His hands moved over her body with confidence, his mouth claiming hers with growing dominance. Sarah's cries of pleasure filled the room as Scott's shyness dissolved completely beneath the intensity of their connection. When they finally collapsed beneath the sheets, Scott held Sarah close, his hand resting over her heart. "I'm never letting you go," he whispered. Sarah smiled sleepily against his chest. "I'm not going anywhere." and Scott believed her. His addiction to her love was no longer something he feared. It was something he welcomed. He had spent 15 years hiding behind his shyness, but now that Sarah had broken through those walls, Scott knew there was no turning back. He needed her in a way he had never needed anything before, and Sarah was more than ready to give him everything he craved. Scott had found the love he never thought he deserved, and now he was ready to fight for it, to drown in it, because life without Sarah was no longer an option. A month after their passionate nights had begun, Sarah started noticing subtle changes in her body. At first, she brushed them off as stress from work. After all, being a doctor meant long shifts and unpredictable hours. But soon, the signs became harder to ignore. Her body felt different, heavier in a strange way, and there was a persistent nausea that seemed to creep up on her at the most inconvenient times. One morning, she woke up feeling unusually dizzy, her hand pressed against her stomach as a wave of discomfort rolled through her. Scott, who had been sleeping beside her, immediately woke up. Concern etched into his face as he sat up and brushed his hand over her forehead. "Sarah, are you okay?" he asked softly, his deep voice laced with worry. Sarah forced a smile, not wanting to alarm him. "I'm fine. Probably just tired." But deep down, a quiet suspicion began to grow in her mind. Her body wasn't just tired, it was changing. Scott watched her closely over the next few days, his protective instincts kicking in as he made sure she ate enough and rested properly. But Sarah knew she needed answers. One afternoon, after her shift at the hospital, Sarah slipped into an examination room and conducted a quick test on herself. Her heart hammered as she stared at the results, her breath catching in her throat. Pregnant. Her eyes widened, her hand instinctively going to her stomach, as a wave of disbelief and overwhelming joy swept through her. But the surprise didn't stop there. When she scheduled an ultrasound to confirm the pregnancy, the doctor smiled at her warmly and said, "Congratulations, doctor. Sarah, it's twins. Twins." Sarah's hands flew to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Twins. The word echoed in her mind, a mixture of shock and wonder swirling inside her chest. She knew what this meant, not just for her, but for Scott. He had been alone for so long, guarded by his shyness and hesitation, and now their love had created not one, but two lives. Her heart raced with excitement and nervousness as she left the hospital, clutching the ultrasound photo tightly in her hands. That evening, Sarah walked into Scott's penthouse with trembling hands. Scott was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his suit jacket hanging loosely off his shoulders as he scrolled through his phone. When he saw her, his brow furrowed with concern. "Sarah?" he asked, setting his phone down and walking toward her. Sarah smiled shakily, her heart pounding as she reached into her purse and handed him the ultrasound photo. Scott took it, his eyes narrowing in confusion as he stared at the black and white image. Slowly, his eyes widened. His breath hitched. "Is this?" Sarah nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm pregnant, Scott." His mouth parted in disbelief, his gaze flying from the photo to her face. You're pregnant?" Sarah nodded again, biting her lip as tears spilled down her cheeks. Scott's hand trembled as he held the ultrasound photo closer, his breath shallow and uneven. But Sarah wasn't finished. "It's twins," she whispered. Scott's eyes shot back to hers, his expression frozen in shock. "Twins?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah smiled through her tears. "Yes, twins." For a long moment, Scott didn't move. Then, without warning, he dropped the ultrasound photo and pulled Sarah into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. His face buried against her shoulder as his body shook with quiet sobs. "Twins. We're going to have a family," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. Sarah wrapped her arms around his neck, her own tears falling freely now. Yes, a family. Scott pulled back slightly, his hands cradling her face as his eyes, shining with tears, locked onto hers. "I can't believe this," he said breathlessly. "After all these years, I never thought." He shook his head, his thumb brushing tenderly over her cheek. "Sarah, you've given me more than I ever thought I deserved." Sarah smiled, her hands resting over his. "You deserve this, Scott. You deserve happiness. And now, we have 2 reasons to be happy." Scott's lips curved into a soft smile before he kissed her deeply, his lips lingering against hers with quiet reverence. When he pulled away, his gaze softened. "We're going to be parents," he whispered, almost to himself. His hands slid down to her stomach, resting there as though he was already trying to protect the lives growing inside her. Sarah watched the vulnerability in his eyes, the deep awe and wonder etched across his face, and her heart melted. Scott's shy nature had kept him guarded for so long, but now, as he stood before her with his hands on her belly, there was nothing but pure love in his eyes. Over the next few days, Scott became even more protective of Sarah. He insisted on driving her to work, sending his personal driver to pick her up after shifts and making sure she rested properly. He rearranged his business schedule so he could be home early to cook for her, or at least try, since Sarah quickly realized that cooking was not Scott's strength. But the effort he put into it made her love him even more. One evening, Sarah woke up to find Scott sitting beside her, his hand resting gently over her stomach as he whispered softly, "Hi, babies. It's your dad," he murmured, his voice low and tender. Sarah watched through half-lidded eyes as Scott leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to her belly. "I can't wait to meet you both. I promise I'm going to protect you and your mom forever." Sarah's heart swelled, tears pricking her eyes. She reached down and brushed her fingers through Scott's dark hair. He looked up at her, his expression so soft and vulnerable that her chest ached. "I love you, Scott," she whispered. Scott's eyes darkened with emotion as he rose to kiss her softly. "I love you too," he said, "and I love them already." Sarah smiled, cupping his face. "We're going to be a family." Scott's arms slid around her as he pulled her close. "The best family," he whispered. "I'm never letting you go, Sarah. You and our babies. You're my world now." Sarah nestled against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. For the first time in her life, she felt whole. And Scott, once burdened by years of isolation and guarded emotions, had found something he never thought possible. A future built on love, trust, and now, a family. From the moment Scott found out he was going to be a father, something inside him shifted. The quiet, guarded man who had spent years wrapped in the protective shell of his shyness was beginning to transform before Sarah's eyes. It was as if the news of the twins had unlocked a part of him that had been hidden beneath layers of insecurity and hesitation. Scott had always been gentle and considerate with Sarah, but now there was an undeniable boldness in the way he looked at her, touched her, and cared for her. It started with the smallest things, his hand resting more confidently on the small of her back when they walked together, the way he stood a little taller when they entered a room, and how his eyes darkened with fierce protectiveness whenever someone even remotely looked at Sarah the wrong way. Scott began taking more control over his life and his relationship with Sarah, not out of dominance, but because he wanted to make sure she felt secure and cherished every moment of the day. Every morning, Scott woke up earlier than Sarah, and without fail, his first instinct was to place his hand gently over her growing belly, a soft smile tugging at his lips as he whispered to their unborn twins. "Good morning, little ones," he would say, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "It's your dad. I hope you slept well." "Mommy's still sleeping, so you have to be quiet, okay?" Sarah would often wake to the sound of Scott's soft voice, her heart melting at the tenderness in his tone. He would then kiss her belly, resting his forehead against her skin as if he could feel their children's presence through that simple contact. Scott became obsessed with ensuring Sarah's comfort, buying every pregnancy pillow he could find, researching the best prenatal vitamins, and making sure she had every craving satisfied, no matter how ridiculous it seemed. When Sarah woke up craving ice cream at 3 a.m., Scott didn't hesitate. He pulled on a sweatshirt and drove across the city to find the exact brand she wanted. When she said she was hungry for spicy tacos and chocolate cake at the same time, Scott somehow made it happen. But beyond the small gestures, it was the emotional shift in Scott that overwhelmed Sarah the most. He was more present, more engaged, more confident in his role as her partner and the father of their children. His eyes, once hesitant and shadowed by self-doubt, now gleamed with certainty and warmth. He started opening up to her in ways he never had before, telling her about his childhood, his fears, and the deep loneliness he had carried for years before she came into his life. "I was so scared to love you at first," he admitted one evening as they lay in bed, Sarah's head resting against his chest, "because I thought I would mess it up. But now, I can't imagine life without you." Sarah smiled, her fingers tracing gentle patterns across his chest. "You're not going to mess it up, Scott. You already make me and our babies feel so loved." Scott's hand slid down to her belly, his thumb stroking softly over the curve of her growing bump. "I want to give them everything I never had," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "A father who's present, a father who's not afraid to show love." Sarah could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the quiet fear that he might not be enough despite everything he was doing. She cupped his face and kissed him softly. "You already are everything they need, Scott. You're going to be an incredible father." Scott's gaze softened, and for the first time, Sarah saw the last traces of doubt disappear from his expression. His kisses became more confident, his touch more certain, and his love more intense. He no longer hesitated to express himself. He would pull Sarah into his arms without warning, kiss her breathless in the middle of the kitchen, or tell her how beautiful she was when she felt bloated and exhausted. He became fiercely protective of her as her pregnancy progressed. When Sarah's colleagues at the hospital started suggesting that she cut back her hours, Scott didn't hesitate to step in. "He's not overworking himself, right?" he asked one of her colleagues one day, his tone low and serious. The doctor smiled reassuringly. "No, Mr. Whitmore. Sarah is perfectly healthy." But Scott still accompanied Sarah to every appointment, holding her hand tightly as they watched the ultrasound screen together. His eyes would light up every time he heard the rapid heartbeat of the twins, his expression softening with awe. "That's our babies," he would whisper, squeezing Sarah's hand. "They're getting so big." At home, Scott started reading parenting books and even practiced putting together the twins' crib. He insisted on setting up the nursery himself, despite Sarah reminding him that he could hire someone. But Scott wanted to do it himself. It was his way of preparing to be the father he never had. One night, Sarah found him sitting on the floor of the nursery, surrounded by half-assembled furniture and an open instruction manual. "Need help?" she teased, leaning against the doorframe. Scott smiled sheepishly. "I think I'm missing a screw." Sarah walked over and sat beside him, placing her hand over his. "We'll figure it out together." Scott smiled, his eyes soft as he leaned in and kissed her. "Together," he echoed, his confidence extended beyond their home life. At business meetings, Scott's quiet nature had always been interpreted as cold or distant, but now his presence commanded attention. His newfound confidence made him a stronger leader, more decisive, more strategic. But the biggest change was how openly he spoke about Sarah. At one gala event, when a curious guest asked about Sarah's pregnancy, Scott's face softened as he said, We're expecting twins." His pride was unmistakable. Sarah overheard the conversation and smiled as Scott reached for her hand. "You've changed so much," she whispered as they danced later that night. Scott's hand rested over the small of her back as he leaned down to kiss her ear. "Because of you," he whispered, "you gave me the courage to be this man." Sarah's heart swelled as she leaned into him. Every night, Scott kissed her belly before they fell asleep, his hands resting protectively over her growing bump. "Good night, little ones," he would whisper. "I love you, and I love your mommy." Sarah would drift off to sleep wrapped in Scott's arms, feeling more loved and protected than she ever imagined. And as Scott held her close, he knew that his days of loneliness were behind him. He had finally found his purpose, not just as a successful businessman, but as a partner and soon-to-be father. His heart was no longer guarded, no longer weighed down by fear. Because Sarah and their twins had given him something he never thought he deserved: a family, a future, and a love so deep it filled every corner of his soul. The night was perfect, crisp and clear, with the sky stretched out above them like a dark velvet canvas speckled with a million glimmering stars. Scott had planned every detail down to the last second, but his hands were still trembling as he guided Sarah towards the secluded spot in his sprawling estate garden, where a breathtaking canopy of twinkling fairy lights had been arranged to mimic the stars above. Sarah's hand rested delicately in his, and despite the cool evening breeze, her warmth radiated through his palm, steadying his pounding heart. He had been rehearsing this moment for weeks, imagining every possible scenario: what he would say, how he would kneel, how he would react if she hesitated. But none of those plans mattered now because Sarah stood before him, glowing under the soft light of the stars, her radiant brown skin illuminated by the golden lights around them, her beautiful braided hair catching the faint shimmer of the night sky. Her deep, soulful eyes gazed at him with quiet curiosity, as if sensing the nervous anticipation coursing through him. Scott swallowed hard, feeling his pulse hammering in his ears. His knees felt weak, his mouth suddenly dry, but he knew that this was it, the defining moment of his life. He led her to the center of the garden, where a circle of white roses surrounded a small platform beneath a canopy of intertwined lights and vines. The scent of jasmine and fresh roses lingered in the air, adding to the magical atmosphere. Sarah's eyes widened as she took in the beautiful setting, her lips parting in surprise. "Scott, this is beautiful," she whispered, her voice laced with awe. Scott smiled nervously, his thumb brushing over her knuckles as he pulled her to a stop in the center of the circle. "Sarah," he began, his voice low and slightly uneven. She looked at him with quiet concern, sensing the emotional weight behind his words. Scott took a deep breath, and before he could talk himself out of it, he slowly lowered himself to one knee. Sarah's breath hitched as her eyes widened in realization. Scott reached into the pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped it open, revealing a breathtaking diamond ring that glistened under the soft lights. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes instantly shimmering with tears. Scott's heart pounded so hard he was sure she could hear it. His gaze softened as he looked up at her, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah, I've spent most of my life hiding from the world, afraid to let anyone in. My shyness kept me from truly living, from allowing myself to love or be loved. And then you came into my life." His voice grew stronger as his confidence deepened. "You saw me, the real me, even when I struggled to see myself. You made me feel safe, understood, and loved in a way I didn't know was possible. You gave me the courage to step out of the shadows, to embrace love without fear. And now, you've given me the greatest gift of all, our twins." Sarah's tears flowed freely now, slipping down her cheeks as her trembling fingers hovered near her lips. Scott's gaze softened even more as his eyes misted. I want to spend the rest of my life loving you, protecting you, and raising our children together. I want to wake up every morning with you by my side. I want to see our babies grow up with your warmth and kindness. I want to grow old with you, Sarah. His voice dropped lower, rich with love and sincerity. You're my heart, my home, my everything. Scott's hand trembled slightly as he held up the ring. Sarah, will you marry me? Sarah's hands dropped from her mouth as a sob escaped her lips. Her chest heaved as the weight of his words sank into her heart. She dropped to her knees in front of him, her hands cupping his face as her tears spilled onto his cheeks. Yes, she breathed, her voice shaky and filled with joy. Yes, Scott, I'll marry you. Scott's eyes darkened with overwhelming relief and happiness as a tear slipped down his cheek. He slid the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, watching as the diamond caught the light and sparkled brilliantly against her skin. The moment the ring was secure, Sarah threw her arms around his neck, and Scott's hands immediately circled her waist, pulling her against him. Their lips crashed together in a deep, passionate kiss that stole both of their breaths. Scott's hands tangled in her braids as he deepened the kiss, pouring every ounce of his love and devotion into the touch. Sarah's hands framed his face as they kissed beneath the canopy of stars, her body pressing flush against his as if she wanted to fuse herself to him forever. When they finally pulled apart, Scott's forehead rested against hers, their breath mingling in the cool night air. You've made me the happiest man alive, he whispered, his lips brushing against hers. Sarah's smile glowed brighter than the stars above them. And you've given me the greatest gift, a love that's true and pure. Scott's arms tightened around her as he stood, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. Sarah laughed, her arms looping around his neck as he spun her beneath the canopy of lights. Scott's laughter mingled with hers as he lowered her back down and kissed her again, softly this time, reverently, his hands framing her face. I promise, Scott said, his gaze locking with hers, to love you every day for the rest of my life, to protect you and our children, to never let you feel alone or uncertain. You've given me everything, Sarah, and now I want to give you forever. Sarah's hand settled over his heart as her eyes shimmered with love. You already have, Scott. You already have. They stood beneath the stars, their arms wrapped around each other as their hearts beat in perfect sync. Scott's shyness, his insecurities, and his fear of love had all melted away the moment Sarah entered his life. Now he stood as a man transformed, strong, confident, and utterly in love with the woman who had healed him. As they stood beneath the glittering canopy of stars, Scott knew that his life was no longer defined by wealth or loneliness. It was defined by the love he had found in Sarah. And soon, they would become a family. Scott pressed a kiss to Sarah's forehead as she leaned into him, the diamond on her finger catching the light as a symbol of the future they would build together. He had found his heart, and now he was never letting it go. The night was perfect, crisp and clear, with the sky stretched out above them like a dark velvet canvas speckled with a million glimmering stars. Scott had planned every detail down to the last second, but his hands were still trembling as he guided Sarah toward the secluded spot in his sprawling estate garden, where a breathtaking canopy of twinkling fairy lights had been arranged to mimic the stars above. Sarah's hand rested delicately in his, and despite the cool evening breeze, her warmth radiated through his palm, steadying his pounding heart. He had been rehearsing this moment for weeks, imagining every possible scenario, what he would say, how he would kneel, how he would react if she hesitated. But none of those plans mattered now because Sarah stood before him, glowing under the soft light of the stars, her radiant brown skin illuminated by the golden lights around them, her beautiful braided hair catching the faint shimmer of the night sky. Her deep, soulful eyes gazed at him with quiet curiosity, as if sensing the nervous anticipation coursing through him. Scott swallowed hard, feeling his pulse hammering in his ears. His knees felt weak, his mouth suddenly dry, but he knew that this was it, the defining moment of his life. He led her to the center of the garden, where a circle of white roses surrounded a small platform beneath a canopy of intertwined lights and vines. The scent of jasmine and fresh roses lingered in the air, adding to the magical atmosphere. Sarah's eyes widened as she took in the beautiful setting, her lips parting in surprise. "Scott, this is beautiful," she whispered, her voice laced with awe. Scott smiled nervously, his thumb brushing over her knuckles as he pulled her to a stop in the center of the circle. "Sarah," he began, his voice low and slightly uneven. She looked at him with quiet concern, sensing the emotional weight behind his words. Scott took a deep breath, and before he could talk himself out of it, he slowly lowered himself to one knee. Sarah's breath hitched as her eyes widened in realization. Scott reached into the pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped it open, revealing a breathtaking diamond ring that glistened under the soft lights. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes instantly shimmering with tears. Scott's heart pounded so hard he was sure she could hear it. His gaze softened as he looked up at her, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah, I've spent most of my life hiding from the world, afraid to let anyone in. My shyness kept me from truly living, from allowing myself to love or be loved. And then you came into my life." His voice grew stronger as his confidence deepened. "You saw me, the real me, even when I struggled to see myself. You made me feel safe, understood, and loved in a way I didn't know was possible. You gave me the courage to step out of the shadows, to embrace love without fear. And now, you've given me the greatest gift of all, our twins." Sarah's tears flowed freely now, slipping down her cheeks as her trembling fingers hovered near her lips. Scott's gaze softened even more as his eyes misted. "I want to spend the rest of my life loving you, protecting you, and raising our children together. I want to wake up every morning with you by my side. I want to see our babies grow up with your warmth and kindness. I want to grow old with you, Sarah." His voice dropped lower, rich with love and sincerity. "You're my heart, my home, my everything." Scott's hand trembled slightly as he held up the ring. "Sarah, will you marry me?" Sarah's hands dropped from her mouth as a sob escaped her lips. Her chest heaved as the weight of his words sank into her heart. She dropped to her knees in front of him, her hands cupping his face as her tears spilled onto his cheeks. "Yes," she breathed, her voice shaky and filled with joy. "Yes, Scott, I'll marry you." Scott's eyes darkened with overwhelming relief and happiness as a tear slipped down his cheek. He slid the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, watching as the diamond caught the light and sparkled brilliantly against her skin. The moment the ring was secure, Sarah threw her arms around his neck, and Scott's hands immediately circled her waist, pulling her against him. Their lips crashed together in a deep, passionate kiss that stole both of their breaths. Scott's hands tangled in her braids as he deepened the kiss, pouring every ounce of his love and devotion into the touch. Sarah's hands framed his face as they kissed beneath the canopy of stars, her body pressing flush against his as if she wanted to fuse herself to him forever. When they finally pulled apart, Scott's forehead rested against hers, their breath mingling in the cool night air. "You've made me the happiest man alive," he whispered, his lips brushing against hers. Sarah's smile glowed brighter than the stars above them. "And you've given me the greatest gift, a love that's true and pure." Scott's arms tightened around her as he stood, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. Sarah laughed, her arms looping around his neck as he spun her beneath the canopy of lights. Scott's laughter mingled with hers as he lowered her back down, and kissed her again. Softly this time, reverently, his hands framing her face. "I promise," Scott said, his gaze locking with hers, "to love you every day for the rest of my life, to protect you and our children, to never let you feel alone or uncertain. You've given me everything, Sarah, and now I want to give you forever." Sarah's hand settled over his heart as her eyes shimmered with love. "You already have, Scott. You already have." They stood beneath the stars, their arms wrapped around each other as their hearts beat in perfect sync. Scott's shyness, his insecurities, and his fear of love had all melted away the moment Sarah entered his life. Now he stood as a man transformed, strong, confident, and utterly in love with the woman who had healed him. As they stood beneath the glittering canopy of stars, Scott knew that his life was no longer defined by wealth or loneliness. It was defined by the love he had found in Sarah, and soon they would become a family. Scott pressed a kiss to Sarah's forehead as she leaned into him, the diamond on her finger catching the light as a symbol of the future they would build together. He had found his heart, and now he was never letting it go.